Alexander was born in 356 BC in the Macedonian capital of Pella. According to legend, it happened the very same night when Herostratus set fire to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Greeks later said there was nothing surprising about the temple burning down, since the goddess was busy at that moment helping Alexander come into the world. The whole life of Alexander the Great turned out to be just like that famous fire, short and blazing, glorious for the ages, and absolutely insane. You're watching History Adventures, and as always, we're heading back in time. In this episode, the secrets, the legends, the facts, and the greatness of Alexander the Great.
His parents didn't really love each other, and both had a strange influence on their son. His mother, obsessed with Alexander's greatness, told the boy that his real father wasn't King Philip of Macedon, but the Olympian god Zeus. So from childhood, she made young Alexander believe he was the son of a god. Philip, meanwhile, was busy conquering Greece, didn't spend much time with young Alexander. He found him a great teacher, the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle, and left his son in his care. The education of a great warrior by a great philosopher became one of the most famous stories in world history. But people sometimes forget the second part of that story. After Alexander's death, poisoning was one of the main versions of events, and Aristotle was one of the main suspects. He had a motive. During the campaign, Alexander ordered the execution of his nephew, the historian Callisthenes, and the great philosopher soon after death, Alexander's death, suspiciously took his own life.
But all that would come later. For now, little Alexander, under Aristotle's kind and wise guidance, was studying philosophy, rhetoric, geometry, medicine, zoology, and geography. What fascinated him most, however, was poetry. He knew by heart the lines from Homer's Iliad praising Achilles, who, through his mother's line, was considered his distant ancestor.
When the boy turned 16, his father made him regent during yet another of his campaigns against the Greeks. While Philip was away, one of the Thracian tribes rose up in rebellion against the Macedonian king.
Alexander crushed the rebels and founded a city on their land, naming it Alexandropolis. Not long before, his father had named a city Philippopolis. Later, Alexander decided Alexandria sounded better than Alexandropolis, and he would go on to found dozens of cities with that name across Eurasia.
2 years later, young Alexander took part in his very first real battle, the Battle of Chaeronea, which ended the classical era in Greece and brought all the city-states under King Philip's rule. Alexander played a decisive role in that battle. His cavalry, the companions, outflanked the Greeks and crushed the elite sacred band of Thebes.
From then on, Alexander was always by Philip's side, but their relationship was complicated. The son was jealous of his father and his military successes. Philip married for the 7th time, not one after another, but 7 wives at once. Soon, people at court whispered that the son from his latest marriage was a more legitimate heir than Alexander or his weak-minded brother. Then, when King Philip attended the wedding of Alexander's sister, he was stabbed to death by his bodyguard, Pausanias.
For over 1,000 years, historians have suspected that Alexander's mother, Olympias, urged the killer. They still debate whether Alexander himself was involved. Maybe, but Pausanias had a personal motive. The story is amazing. He quarreled with another Pausanias, sharply reproaching him for his debauchery. The insult wounded him so deeply that dying on the battlefield after the fight, he asked his lover to avenge the offense. That lover gathered a group of close friends. They invited the unsuspecting Pausanias to a feast, got him very drunk, and then the whole company raped him. Humiliated, Pausanias complained to Philip, but the organizer of the assault turned out to be a relative of the king's new wife. Philip chose not to react, and for that, they say, Pausanias stabbed Philip to death.
Be that as it may, at 20, Alexander became king of Macedonia. He started killing right away. A wave of executions swept through the kingdom. Philip's last wife was forced by Alexander's mother Olympias to hang herself after watching her newborn daughter murdered in her arms. According to another version, the mother and child were boiled alive in a bronze cauldron. Olympias was a creative and determined woman, a son of a god. Rivals go into the pot. So, Alexander immediately showed himself to be an exceptionally determined man. Even though the royal treasury was empty and the kingdom owed 500 talents, he abolished all taxes. Some Greek cities, especially Thebes, saw Philip's death as a chance for independence, but Alexander swiftly crushed those hopes, besieging and taking Thebes. He gave the right to decide the city's fate to his allies from Boeotia, the other Greeks, and after a long discussion, they sentenced their neighbors to complete destruction, the killing of every man, and the sale of all women and children into slavery. A legend says that Alexander ordered the house of one poet he admired to be spared, and it became the only home left standing in all of Thebes. It's curious to imagine how that myth would have played out. Did that poet really stay in his house, surrounded by the ruins of his city and the rotting bodies of his neighbors? In reality, though, the money Alexander gained from selling the Thebans into slavery allowed him to pay off the debts of the Macedonian treasury.
And right after that, he took a new debt, 800 talents. With that money, Alexander began preparing and launching his Great Eastern Campaign, which would take him all the way to India.
Take a look at the map. These are the lands Alexander inherited from Philip.
And later, we'll see how huge his empire became. So, was the Eastern Campaign a coincidence? No. It's known that King Philip had been preparing it and even managed to begin, sending Macedonian troops into Asia Minor, where his son Alexander, once he took power, ordered them to hold their position and take no action yet.
But Philip wasn't the one who came up with the idea of such a campaign. It had been floating around Greek society for a long time. Many different people had proposed and discussed the plan of invasion. Everyone could see that Greek mercenaries were the best part of the Persian army. The Greeks clearly fought better than the Persians. They had already crushed their invasions twice. To invade the Persian state, seize its rich booty, and maybe even take a few Anatolian satrapies, that goal looked tempting to many in Greece. And most important, only such a project could pull the conquered Greeks behind the Macedonian conquerors. Officially, it was billed as a campaign to avenge the Persians for what Athens had provoked 100 years before.
So basically, Alexander didn't really have a choice, whether to go on that campaign or not. Though I must say, he had no doubts. He dreamed of it. Many Greeks strongly supported the idea. The cities sent their own troops, 7,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry in total. The core Macedonian army counted 12,000 infantry and 1,800 companion cavalry. There were also various mercenaries and allied tribes, along with the forces that Philip had already sent ahead into Asia Minor altogether, about 50,000 men in total. That's how many Alexander led with him into Persia. Alexander landed at the supposed site of ancient Troy to offer a sacrifice at the place where his hero Achilles had died. And before stepping onto the Asian shore, he threw his spear into it, as a sign that he would claim that land by force of arms.
The invasion was successful right from the start. It was supported by the Ionian Greeks, the Greeks living in Asia Minor. Their cities switched sides one after another, joining Alexander's Greeks and Macedonians. For the Persians and their subjects, the Greek invasion wasn't much of a surprise. They had already discussed a plan in case of Macedonian aggression. The commander of the Greek mercenaries, Memnon, advised not to fight his countrymen head-on, but to retreat before Alexander's army, burning everything in their path.
The scorched earth tactic, most likely, would have turned out deadly for Alexander's army. But the Persian satraps refused to follow it. They didn't want to burn their own rich lands. However, they agreed to the second part of the plan, to send Memnon himself with his soldiers by sea to Greece, where, taking advantage of Alexander's absence, he could weaken his power or even completely destroy his alliance with the Greek city-states, harming their cohesion.
And in Asia Minor, the Persians attacked on the 4th day after the landing. The Battle of the Granicus took place near Troy and ended in Alexander's victory. The Persian king Darius lost control over all of Asia Minor and much of the Middle East. Alexander then hurried there with his troops, realizing that the fate of the eastern Mediterranean depended on the sea, where the Persians had a huge fleet, and the Macedonians almost none.
The only possible way for Alexander to achieve victory in such a situation was to seize all the naval bases of the Persian fleet spread along the whole eastern Mediterranean coast.
And so he led his troops south from Asia Minor, capturing one ancient Phoenician city after another across the Middle East. That's how he reached Egypt, and after taking it, he went to the famous oracle of Amun to learn his destiny.
The priests addressed Alexander as the son of a god, confirming the stories his mother had told him. Looking back at this history now, it sometimes feels like he simply couldn't lose. Smart, determined, talented, and backed by a great army. But in truth, it wasn't really about him. It was the Persians' mistake. The commander of the Greek mercenaries, Memnon, had told them exactly how to defeat Alexander with a scorched earth tactic. They didn't listen. Alexander marched endlessly across rich and plentiful lands.
But Memnon's landing in Greece was a heavy blow for Alexander. The Macedonian had captured the Persian fleet's bases, but the fleet itself was no longer there. It was off the coast of Greece, and things were going well for Memnon. Many Greeks were joining his side, and those who stayed loyal to Alexander he defeated in battle. But then, during the siege of one Greek city, Memnon suddenly fell ill and died, and that was it. The entire Persian strategy simply collapsed.
Alexander and his army marched back north, where he defeated Darius in the grand and decisive Battle of Gaugamela. That was already his second victory over the Persian king. Earlier, he had defeated him in the Battle of Issus. Alexander's tactics were exactly the same. Leading his companions, he charged straight toward Darius's chariot and began cutting his way through the royal guard for a decisive duel with the king. Darius panicked and fled the battlefield, leaving his army behind in complete disarray and without command. After the victory at Gaugamela, the Macedonians and Greeks took Babylon, where Alexander was proclaimed ruler of all. In December, they captured Susa, taking 40,000 talents, and in January, Persepolis, seizing the entire royal treasury of 120,000 talents. So, the spring of 330 BC was probably the happiest time in the short life of Alexander the Great. The victory was celebrated so wildly that in May they burned down the royal palace, the main residence of the Achaemenid dynasty. Ancient historians tell of the courtesan Thais of Athens, who, during a drunken feast, supposedly persuaded Alexander to set the palace on fire.
However, modern excavations have shown that before the fire, all the treasures had been taken out of the palace. Besides, the entire Eastern campaign had been conceived and presented in Greece as revenge for Xerxes' invasion in 480 BC, when he burned Athens. So burning down the palace built by Xerxes was quite a logical move, without any influence of courtesans or drunken feasts. After such a blazing finale to the campaign, Alexander dismissed the Greeks and stayed in Persia only with his Macedonians. Soon after, he led them in pursuit of Darius.
After Gaugamela, Darius retreated east into Media. Good roads led to Babylon and Persepolis, but there were none in Media. And Darius rightly assumed that Alexander wouldn't chase him there, choosing instead to stay behind and collect his spoils. Darius probably hoped that the Greeks would start fighting among themselves over the spoils or simply return home, which is why he took no real action while Alexander was capturing his capitals and burning down his royal palaces.
When it became clear that the Greeks hadn't quarreled over the spoils and Alexander was marching east, Darius once again ordered a retreat. Then the eastern satraps placed the Persian king under arrest. As the Macedonians began to catch up, the guards, led by the satrap Bessus, hurled their spears at the king and fled. Darius was dead.
But soon it became clear that Alexander had no intention of returning to Macedonia, as his soldiers had hoped, nor of staying in Babylon, which would have been the most reasonable choice. He didn't believe the campaign was over and was determined to keep going, setting off into the distant and unknown lands of the east. As he explained to his troops, in the east there was the satrap of Sogdiana and Bactria Bessus. The man who had killed Darius and Alexander had to deal with him and eliminate a rival.
There was no choice. The Macedonians followed their king eastward. As they went, they kept trying to fit the lands they saw into the geography they knew, calling the Hindu Kush Mountains Caucasus. About 50 kilometers from what is now the city of Kabul, they founded a new settlement that Alexander named Alexandria of the Caucasus. Somewhere around what is now Afghanistan, Alexander was clearly overcome by paranoia. He had been flooded with reports and accusations since the very start of the campaign, but for a long time he ignored them, trusting the people around him. Yet, with every new report he read, his suspicion grew, until finally he began uncovering conspiracies.
During his investigation, Alexander discovered that one of his best men, Philotas, the commander of the Royal Isle, the elite unit of the Macedonian army, those very same companion friends who had followed Alexander through every battle, had known about the conspiracy. The king held a public trial where he fiercely accused Philotas, and Philotas just as fiercely defended himself before the entire army assembly. Alexander insisted on the death sentence and ordered his close friend to be tied to a post and executed with spears. Parmenion, Philotas's father, hadn't been accused of any conspiracy, but Alexander decided it would be unwise to let him live. After his son's execution, a messenger was sent to the old general, a close friend of King Philip. As Parmenion began reading the king's letter, the messenger stabbed him to death. After wintering in the region, in the spring of 329 BC, the Macedonians crossed the Hindu Kush and entered Bactria. The local commanders, the foremost among them Spitamenes, had no wish to fight Alexander and handed over Bessus, who had fled to them, to the Macedonians.
They brought Bessus to Alexander naked and in chains. The king asked why he had arrested his own king, Darius, who was also his relative and benefactor, and then killed him. Bessus replied that it hadn't been his decision alone. The entire royal entourage had agreed to it.
Alexander didn't like the answer. He ordered the naked prisoner to be whipped first, then to have his nose and the tips of his ears cut off, and afterward to be sent to Darius's relatives for execution.
Then Alexander appointed as governor of Bactria and Sogdiana, not Spitamenes, who had helped him, but one of his own men. From the king's point of view, it was a logical move. But the locals didn't see it that way. In those seemingly peaceful satrapies, the fire of guerrilla war began to spread. Alexander chose to fight it in the most ordinary way. Through terror against the civilian population, cities that supported the rebels were burned along with their inhabitants. Ancient historians estimate the victims of this genocide at around 200,000 people.
Alexander made another mistake. He began building the fortress of Alexandria Eshate, meaning the farthest, to protect himself from the Scythians. Historians believe it was located in what is now Tajikistan, near the city of Khujand. The Scythians attacked, and a fierce war began, though we know about it only from Greek sources. They claim that Alexander defeated the Scythians in battle, but was soon forced to retreat after drinking bad water from a lake, which gave him severe stomach troubles and nearly cost him his life. Maybe so, but it's hard to understand how foot phalangites could possibly defeat mounted archers out on the open steppe.
And the more he conquered, the more difficult and tense his relations with his companions became. In that hard and restless year, 328 BC, the bond between Alexander and the comrades who had started the great campaign with him finally collapsed. The king had long since begun wearing Eastern clothes and was surrounded by Persians and Bactrians who greeted Alexander in the Eastern way with proskynesis, a full bow before the king. Their knees, elbows, stomach, chest, and chin had to touch the ground. When he started demanding the same from the Macedonians, the real trouble began.
Alexander understood that he would rule not just Macedonia, and not even Greece, but all of Asia, and therefore, he had to adopt the style of rule familiar to the local peoples, where the king was treated as a divine living god. But who can tell where, in Alexander's mind, the line lay between political calculation and pure megalomania? The Macedonians thought their king had gone a little mad. Many of them had served his father Philip and were old enough to be Alexander's fathers themselves. And now they were expected to bow before this young man and kiss his feet?
Of course they weren't okay with it. They reacted to proskynesis with pure mockery. When Persians at banquets lay flat before Alexander, the drunken Macedonians would laugh, heckle, make rude jokes, and throw food at them. At one of those feasts came the most infamous episode of Alexander's Eastern campaign. He was drunk and killed his friend Clitus. By then, the Macedonian elite had been on a 2-year drinking binge ever since they started celebrating their victory somewhere around Babylon. They hadn't really stopped. Banquets were held almost every night, and they drank themselves into the worst possible state.
The argument between Alexander and Clitus began over divinity. Flatterers compared Alexander to ancient heroes and gods and insisted he surpassed them in absolutely everything. To the drunken Clitus, it sounded like pure blasphemy he couldn't keep his mouth shut, and a fight broke out. Alexander and Clitus were milk brothers. Clitus's mother had been Alexander's wet nurse. And so these two close men were shouting, lunging at each other, being pulled apart only to grab each other again. In short, a typical drunken brawl. At one point, Clitus shouted, "What kind of god are you if I, with this very hand, once saved your life at the Battle of the Granicus?" The remark, though fair, deeply offended Alexander. He snatched a spear from a guard, thrust it into Clitus's stomach, and killed him. Basically, and sadly, it was a typical story. Things like that still happen even today. But you know what happened the next morning? Alexander was devastated by Clitus's death. He didn't eat for 3 days and kept weeping over the body of the milk brother he had killed. It was more than remorse. In that moment, it was the breakdown of a man in wild emotional turmoil, completely unable to control himself.
Yet he was still very much a genius. The conquest of Sogdiana was not yet complete. When Alexander finally pulled himself together, he crushed the Sogdian detachments and drove their leaders onto a sheer 300-meter cliff, one thought to be impossible to capture. But Alexander's soldiers secretly climbed the cliff at night, and the war in Sogdiana was completely won. Alexander treated the defeated mercifully. He had already understood that he could not hold these lands by force alone. On his orders, many Macedonians married local noble women, and Alexander himself married Roxana.
And his enemy Spitamenes met a shameful end out on the steppe. His own wife killed him and brought his head to the Macedonians. Well, she probably didn't like the idea of endlessly wandering the steppes and deserts as a rebel's wife. Fair enough. After settling things in Sogdiana, Alexander led his army farther on. No one really understood where they were going. They were marching to India, where the Macedonians were about to encounter elephants, creatures that amazed their imagination. For the first time, they faced elephants in battle at the river Hydaspes, where Alexander's army clashed with the forces of the Indian king Porus. When the elephants charged, the Macedonians ran straight at them to fight hand to hand.
In the time of the Diadochi Wars, when elephants would be used by the armies of many kingdoms, the whole ancient world would know that one must never get too close to elephants. It was much wiser to attack them from a distance, driving the animals into panic. But the Macedonians at the river Hydaspes lacked such precious knowledge and defeated the elephants in a fierce close fight.
The Macedonian troops were victorious. But in the summer of 325 BC, the soldiers of Alexander the Great told their king they would march no farther. They couldn't stand the harsh Indian climate and the fact that every new campaign was followed by even greater massacres of the civilian population. But most of all, it felt unfair. The Greeks had long since gone back home to Greece and were now enjoying the fruits of their shared victory, while the Macedonians were forced to keep fighting some barbarians in these burning lands.
The king had no choice but to turn back, and he never forgave his soldiers for that. He led them through the desert of Gedrotia, where countless men who had followed Alexander across the known world perished. When they finally returned to Babylon, the king no longer trusted his Macedonians. He dismissed 11,000 of them and replaced their ranks with young Persians trained to fight in the Greek manner. His soldiers couldn't stand it and rose in rebellion, which Alexander crushed with ruthless force.
Quite suddenly, he died on the 10th or 13th of June, 323 BC. He was only 33.
Take a look at the map. These are the lands Alexander conquered.
The debates about whether it was murder and who could have carried it out still haven't stopped to this day. It might have been a completely natural death. People often died of illness back then, but it might also have been poisoning. And despite our idealized view of this great and legendary historical figure, by the end of his life, everyone around Alexander wanted him dead. The Persians because he was a foreign conqueror, the Macedonians because he favored the Persians, the Greeks because he had subdued their city-states. He had plenty of enemies. And that's hardly surprising. According to the sources, he was a cruel, aggressive, and rather unstable man, but with an enormously inflated ego that often showed in his behavior. He'd been told since childhood that he was a god, and his brilliant life more or less seemed to prove it.
His claims to divinity proved costly. Alexander's plans were grand beyond measure: to build a port and fleet in the Persian Gulf, sail to Africa, capture Carthage, and carve his head into Mount Athos so that a small city would stand upon the vast stone palm. In these enormous projects, like in a blazing furnace, perished all the colossal treasures Alexander had taken from Persia.
There's a belief that if Alexander hadn't died when he did, he could have built a world where the ancient West and East were fully integrated, and that our world today would be completely different. That idea is actually quite popular in the West. This idea rests on very idealized and exaggerated notions about Alexander. According to the sources, by the time of his death at 33, this remarkable man had no treasury and no army left, and his mind was seriously shattered. Such a person couldn't have united worlds, nor did he ever plan to do so. Tell us which historical figure you'd like us to make a video about. Write to us right here in the comments. We promise to read every single one of them and surely pick someone for the next story. You've been watching History Adventures, and I'm Alina. Bye for now.